He never expected that stepping off a plane could feel like stepping onto a battleground. For most travelers, JFK Airport in New York was a gateway to the city's skyscrapers and bright lights, a place of comings and goings, filled with the hum of excitement. But for Chris Hemsworth, it became something else entirely. His flight from Los Angeles had been uneventful. Long, yes, but nothing out of the ordinary. He was accustomed to the hustle of airport terminals, the swirl of paparazzi whenever he touched down in a new city. He built a career on playing strong, poised characters. Yet that morning, as he navigated the corridors leading to customs and border protection, an unsettling tension coiled in the air. He was here for an urgent philanthropic event involving several children's hospitals across the East Coast. The public knew him as an actor with a heart of gold, always willing to lend his time or star power for a good cause. But as he entered the immigration checkpoint, the flash of a stern uniform and a pair of relentless eyes signaled that he might be in for an encounter unlike anything he had ever experienced. Even before he reached the counter, he could sense it, a subtle hostility that seeped through the crowd, zeroing in on him. Little did Chris Hemsworth know, within the next hour, he would be fighting more than jet lag. He'd be fighting for his reputation, his freedom, and a chance to finish the mission that brought him there in the first place. Chris took one step forward and felt the steady pulse of nerves beneath his calm exterior. A flick of the overhead fluorescent lights caught the shine of the border officer's polished badge. The man stood tall and rigid behind the podium, brow furrowed, lips set in a thin line. His nameplate read Officer Daryl Jackson, though Chris couldn't yet guess the significance of that name. "Passport," Jackson said curtly. No greeting, no smile. Chris handed it over, aware of a few passengers behind him who recognized him from across the velvet ropes. Some of them whispered, and he could sense their curiosity. Being famous usually smoothed the wheels, but something about Officer Jackson's posture suggested it might do the opposite this time. The officer studied the passport photo. He frowned, then lifted his gaze to compare the picture to Chris's face. "Purpose of your visit?" "Charity events," Chris replied, voice level. "I'm visiting a few hospitals along the East Coast, also scheduled to attend a fundraising gala in Washington, D.C. Jackson tapped at his computer keyboard as if the device had personally offended him. "So, you're an actor, right?" "Australian." "Yes, sir." There was a loaded pause. "We have a lot of Australian actors coming through. Don't see too many who draw a crowd in line, though." Jackson eyed the small commotion behind the rope divider, passengers craning their necks, phones out, hoping to capture a picture. "Don't see why people make such a fuss." Chris attempted a friendly smile. "I'm just here for the work." Jackson's expression remained unchanged. "I need you to step aside, sir." An uncomfortable hush descended. Chris felt a wave of surprise. He'd been through dozens of airports, countless immigration checkpoints. Normally, the process was professional but swift. Check the passport, confirm the reason for travel, wave him through. But here, Jackson's tone left no room for debate. "Is there an issue?" Chris asked. "Security protocols," Jackson said, giving a cryptic shrug. "We've had some red flags come up." Chris's heart thumped harder. Red flags? He was no stranger to tighter security measures, especially since certain high-profile individuals sometimes got flagged. But the hardness in Jackson's gaze suggested this was something else. Jackson turned to a younger officer standing nearby. "Officer Diaz, watch the line for me. I'll be escorting Mr. Hemsworth for a more detailed screening." Chris inhaled a deep breath. He knew better than to argue. Instead, he glanced behind him one last time at the line of waiting travelers, noticing the growing swirl of gossip, then followed Officer Jackson through a side door into an area of the airport most travelers never saw. The initial conflict revealed itself clearly in the cramped secondary screening room. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, giving everything a stark, clinical glow. Rows of chairs lined one side of the space, and a long table stood at the front. On it sat scanning devices and boxes of gloves, tools that could either confirm innocence or amplify suspicion. Chris had seen many behind-the-scenes areas, but rarely under these circumstances. "Take a seat," Jackson said, nodding toward a hard plastic chair. Chris complied, dropping his duffel bag to the floor. "Officer Jackson, might I ask why I'm being held for extra screening?" Jackson busied himself with rummaging through drawers filled with forms. "It's procedure, Mr. Hemsworth. We see a name come up with certain markers. We investigate." Chris frowned. "What markers?" Jackson looked up, a flicker of antagonism in his eyes. "Your name on a watch list." Shock flashed through Chris like a lightning bolt. He tried to remain composed. "That's impossible. There must be a mistake." "Is that so?" Jackson pulled out a clipboard and slapped a form on top. "Then maybe we can clear it up. But for now, we do this by the book." Chris had to fight back the impulse to demand immediate release. Instead, he reminded himself to stay calm. A confrontation would only make matters worse. He looked around the Stark room, noticing that aside from Jackson, there were no other officers in immediate earshot. A watch list? That was no trivial matter. Either some clerical error had ensnared his name, or something more concerning was at play. He settled his gaze back on Jackson, noting the subtle smugness in the man's expression. Chris realized this was not going to be a simple misunderstanding. "I'll cooperate," he said, "but I'd like to speak to someone who can verify or correct that information as quickly as possible. I've got obligations, hospital visits scheduled, sick kids expecting me." Jackson dropped into a chair behind the table, flipping open Chris's passport. "Sure, we'll look into it. Meanwhile, let's see if you have anything to hide." The words felt like a challenge. Already, a sense of dread tangled in Chris's gut. He knew this wouldn't be an easy chat. The real question was whether something more dangerous lurked beneath Jackson's stony glare. The first major twist arrived sooner than Chris expected, setting off the roller coaster that would define the rest of his day. As Jackson scanned a computer database and cross-referenced Chris's details, the officer's expression darkened. "Looks like your name was flagged in connection with an international case we're tracking." Chris felt the chair beneath him grow colder. "What case?" Without lifting his eyes from the screen, Jackson pursed his lips. "There's a ring of individuals smuggling high-value antiquities into the country. Part of a major black market operation. One of the suspects apparently traveled under an alias that suspiciously overlaps with your details." He finally raised his gaze. "Tell me something. Did you travel to Southeast Asia recently?" Chris's brow furrowed in confusion. He had filmed in various locations around the world, but not Southeast Asia in the past year. His last Asia trip had been months ago for a charity documentary in Indonesia. "I was in Indonesia for relief work, months back. Nothing else. Not sure how that would link me to smuggling." Jackson let out a low, humorless chuckle. "Well, let's see if your story checks out. These smugglers often hide contraband in personal luggage. I'll need to search your bags, thoroughly." Chris tried not to bristle. "Go ahead." A part of him wondered if this was some elaborate scam, or if Jackson was pursuing a personal vendetta. But the mention of an actual black market ring made it sound all too real. Jackson rummaged through Chris's duffel, pulling out neatly folded clothes, a few scripts, workout gear, and a small box of promotional materials for the charity. Nothing suspicious. Then, at the bottom of the bag, he found a small wooden carving. Chris recognized it instantly. It was a gift from a local craftsman in Indonesia, a token of gratitude for the aid work Chris had done. It had been carefully declared and cleared by customs when he first brought it back to Australia. Now, in the glare of JFK's screening room, that simple carving took on a menacing quality. Jackson lifted the carving, turning it over in his hands as if it might hold hidden secrets. It was shaped like a bird, intricately carved from dark wood. "You mind telling me what this is?" "A gift," Chris explained. "I've had it for months. It has sentimental value." Jackson arched an eyebrow. You didn't think to declare it. I declared it when I re-entered Australia. It's not contraband. Let me be the judge of that. Jackson set it aside. A pregnant silence stretched between them, broken only by the quiet hum of the air conditioning. Chris's mind whirled with possibilities. Could this innocuous item be twisted into something sinister? Suddenly, Jackson slammed the carving onto the table. Don't move, he barked. He reached into a drawer, pulled out an evidence bag, and gingerly placed the carving inside. We'll be testing this. Chris's nerves kicked into higher gear. Testing it for what? Residual compounds. Drugs, perhaps. We've had cases where seemingly innocent souvenirs turned out to be coated in illegal substances. That's absurd. Is it? Jackson shot back. You'd be surprised what desperate people will do. The officer's unwavering hostility was a blow to Chris's composure. He'd come to the airport expecting a normal commute. Now, he was under suspicion for trafficking something he cherished only for its memory. Minutes felt like hours as Jackson set the carving aside and scribbled notes. You claim it's just a gift, he said. But we'll see what the lab says. Chris swallowed hard. Everything spiraled beyond reason. He realized that even though he was innocent, the machinery of suspicion could churn out devastating consequences. If Jackson found so much as a reason to hold him, Chris would miss his charity event, fail to show up for the children in need, and face humiliation on the public stage. The stakes soared, and he had no idea how to stop this train from wrecking his entire trip. The tension mounted when Jackson left the room briefly, presumably to check the carving for any suspicious substances. Chris remained alone for several minutes, anxiety building with each tick of the clock on the wall. He forced himself to breathe slowly. He had done nothing wrong, yet all it took was one false reading, one prejudiced official, or one unlucky coincidence, and he could be mired in legal mess for months. Moments later, Jackson returned, his face unreadable. He dropped back into the chair, rummaged through the passport again, then flicked a glance up at Chris. While we wait for the results, I have more questions. Chris nodded. Go ahead. Your so-called charity stops, who set them up? An organization called Hope Heals. They coordinate hospital visits. I've worked with them before. Jackson's eyes narrowed. Hope Heals is legit, but you can't blame me for asking. Criminals often hide behind philanthropic fronts. How many times have we seen celebrities in the news, linked to shady dealings? Chris tried to keep his voice even. I understand you're doing your job, but you'll find nothing shady about me. Jackson drummed his fingers on the tabletop. We'll see. We have procedures to follow. The door to the screening area swung open, and a tall, broad-shouldered man in a black suit stepped inside. He glanced at Chris, then pivoted sharply to Jackson. Officer Jackson, a word. He jerked his head toward the hallway. For a moment, Chris spotted a flicker of annoyance on Jackson's face. Without acknowledging Chris, Jackson followed the man out. Through the cracked doorway, Chris heard urgent whispers, though he couldn't make out all the words. He caught fragments. Protocol, high-profile detainee, discretionary measures. Chris exhaled. That might be a good sign. Someone was stepping in, perhaps to mitigate the situation. But why did Jackson seem annoyed? Was the officer enjoying pushing him around? Or was there a deeper reason for his hostility? When Jackson came back, his eyes were blazing. The man in the suit hovered behind him, arms crossed. Jackson cleared his throat. Mr. Hemsworth, your test results aren't back yet, but my supervisor is suggesting we expedite processing because of, well, who you are. There was clear resentment in his voice. I'm not one to give special treatment, but the supervisor here insists we handle this swiftly. Chris ventured. I appreciate the help. I just want to clear my name and be on my way. Jackson shot him a look that carried an undercurrent of defiance. I'm still waiting for that lab report. Until it arrives, we hold. The supervisor stepped forward, offering Chris a polite nod. We apologize for any inconvenience, Mr. Hemsworth. We just want to ensure all protocols are followed. Chris acknowledged the man's courtesy. "I understand, sir, but I have to emphasize how important it is for me to attend these hospital visits." The supervisor gave a small sigh. "We'll do our best. Officer Jackson will keep you informed." With that, the supervisor left. The door shut behind him, leaving Chris alone again with Jackson. The officer studied Chris for a moment, leaning back in his chair. An unsettling stillness stretched between them. "Looks like you have friends in high places," Jackson said, the words dripping with an edge of sarcasm. Chris caught a note of bitterness. "I didn't ask for any favors. I just want this resolved." Jackson smirked. "Don't worry, I'm sure it will be." Something about the officer's tone put Chris on high alert. There was more going on here than standard procedure. He considered that maybe Jackson's hostility wasn't just personal bias. Perhaps there was a hidden agenda at play. As the minutes ticked by, the dreaded possibility of missing the first hospital visit weighed heavily on Chris. He checked his watch. Time was slipping away. Meanwhile, Jackson spent his time tapping away at the computer and occasionally stepping out to speak with someone in hushed tones. Whatever was being said behind closed doors, it wasn't happening quickly enough. Finally, Jackson returned, eyes gleaming with an unsettling satisfaction. The test came back inconclusive. "We're sending it for further analysis." Chris stiffened. "Inconclusive? That's not possible, it's just a carving." Jackson shrugged. "Could be contaminated in some way, until we're certain we can't release you." A surge of frustration burned in Chris's chest. He inhaled deeply, striving to stay calm. "Officer Jackson, with respect, this is starting to feel like deliberate stalling. If there's truly nothing suspicious, we could easily verify that by scanning the carving with more precise tools." "You have the means." Jackson's gaze hardened. "Don't tell me how to do my job." Chris opened his mouth to respond, but the door opened again, revealing a short, gray-haired woman in a crisp uniform. She carried a tablet under one arm and wore an expression of exasperation. "Officer Jackson, this is going on too long," she said, stepping inside and glancing at Chris. "I'm Lieutenant Berg. We're receiving inquiries from the State Department. They want an update." Jackson's jaw tightened. "I'm following procedure, Lieutenant." Berg glanced at the evidence bag on the table. "Could you hurry it up? The man isn't a flight risk. He doesn't match any known suspect descriptions. And quite frankly, we have no cause to hold him beyond an inconclusive test. The labs are backlogged, and it could be hours." Jackson crossed his arms. "With all due respect, Lieutenant, we have reason to believe he might be linked to a black market operation." She eyed Chris's passport, reading his name. "He's not unknown to us, officer. We see celebrities here often. Usually, they pass quickly. This entire fiasco has already created a PR headache. Social media is lighting up. Someone posted that ChrisHemsworth was detained by a rude border guard. Now we have reporters asking questions." Chris felt an odd pang of relief, realizing that onlookers in the main immigration hall must have filmed or tweeted the moment Jackson pulled him aside. Word traveled fast. Jackson's face reddened. "I'm just doing my job." "Well, be mindful we're in the crosshairs now," Berg said sharply. "We answer to higher-ups." She turned to Chris, her voice gentler. "We'll make this right, Mr. Hemsworth. The last thing we need is a scandal." For the first time, Chris felt a flicker of hope. Maybe reason would finally prevail. Yet as Berg marched out of the room, Jackson's cold stare lingered. "Higher-ups," Jackson muttered. "They always want special treatment for celebrities." Chris remained silent. Jackson's resentment was obvious. But what if it wasn't just about jealousy? He sensed something deeper, like Jackson was determined to block him at every turn, for reasons that stretched beyond standard security. Feeling the pressure of time, Chris made his first attempt at resolving the situation directly. He knew he had an attorney on retainer for the occasional contract dispute or any legal matter that might arise. Summoning his composure, Chris asked, "Officer Jackson, may I have permission to make a phone call?" Jackson shot him a look. "This isn't prison. You can call someone if you want, but stay in sight. Chris pulled out his phone, stepping to a corner of the room. He dialed his attorney's number, praying she would pick up. After a couple of rings, her calm, professional voice came through. "Hello, Chris. Everything all right?" He explained the situation in hushed tones, how he was being held at JFK due to an inconclusive test on a souvenir. The mention of a black market suspicion, the possibility of missing his charity commitments. His attorney, Carmen Green, was quick to respond. "This is unacceptable. I'll contact the Customs and Border Protection Legal Department immediately. They have protocols for high-profile detainees. You shouldn't be subjected to indefinite delays over an inconclusive test." Relief washed over him. "Thanks, Carmen. I appreciate any help." She assured him she would get on it right away, urging him to remain patient. "Keep me updated," she said. He ended the call and turned back, only to find Jackson's eyes drilling into him. "Lawyer, huh?" Chris nodded, unfazed. "I have every right." Jackson rolled his jaw. Wouldn't expect anything less from a Hollywood type. Trying not to rise to the bait, Chris retrieved his duffel from the floor. "I just want to expedite this." Jackson shrugged. It might not be that simple. Minutes later, Officer Diaz, the younger officer from the arrival hall, knocked on the door. "Sir," he addressed Jackson quietly, "we've got an update from the labs about that carving." Chris's heart leapt. This could be his chance to be cleared. Jackson nodded to Diaz. "Let's hear it." Diaz hesitated, glancing at Chris. "Do you want me to?" "Out with it," Jackson barked. Diaz cleared his throat. "They said there's definitely no illegal substance, but they found trace amounts of some residue, possibly organic. They need more tests to identify it." Chris raised his eyebrows. Organic residue could just be soil or something from where it was made. Jackson's mouth tightened. "We can't release it yet. They're still not 100% sure." Diaz shifted uncomfortably. "Lieutenant Berg said we don't have grounds to keep him detained while they run more tests." Chris's pulse quickened with hope. "Does that mean I can go?" Jackson's eyes flicked to Diaz, then to Chris. "Wait here." He stepped out into the hallway, shutting the door behind him with a forceful click. Chris and Diaz exchanged a look. The younger officer offered a sympathetic shrug. A few moments later, Chris heard muffled voices, Jackson's unmistakable tone coloring the conversation. He couldn't make out the words, but he recognized the tension. Something was not adding up here, some reason Jackson wouldn't let him walk free. Hidden agenda or not, Chris seized the moment. Officer Diaz was still there, shifting from foot to foot, apparently feeling awkward. Chris spoke calmly. "Officer Diaz, is there any formal complaint or warrant that prevents me from leaving?" Diaz blinked. "Not that I know of, but I'm not in charge." Chris pressed gently. "I understand. But can you at least confirm that the only reason I'm here is because of a flagged passport and an inconclusive test on a wooden carving?" Diaz nodded. "Yes, that's it." "Then," Chris continued, "assuming the carving is cleared, there's no real evidence of wrongdoing, right?" Diaz swallowed. "That's correct, but I can't override Officer Jackson's orders." Chris sighed, tension coiled inside him like a spring. "Do you trust him?" he asked softly. Diaz's eyes darted toward the door. He lowered his voice. "That's a complicated question. Officer Jackson is senior and he's known to be thorough. Some might say too thorough, especially when it comes to certain travelers." "Certain travelers like me," Chris said, picking up on the hint. "High profile, possibly a target for extra scrutiny." Diaz hesitated, clearly caught between professionalism and sympathy. "Look, I shouldn't say too much. But Jackson has been under pressure because of some departmental investigations. They found anomalies in his track record, the number of detentions that never led to charges, specifically with people he seemed to have personal grievances against. He's being watched by internal affairs." The weight of Diaz's confession sank in. So Jackson might have a history of abusing his position. If that was the case, Chris was up against a man with something to prove, a man who might fight tooth and nail to avoid looking incompetent or biased. Chris thanked Diaz quietly for the information, then decided he had to take a different approach. The standard channels, lawyers, supervisors, were hitting bureaucratic snags. And from the look of Jackson's tight-lipped grin, he wouldn't mind dragging this out all day. But if Diaz was right, Internal Affairs was watching Jackson. That meant any overt wrongdoing on Jackson's part could trigger severe consequences. If Chris shed enough public light on this, perhaps Jackson would be forced to back down. Outside in the hallway, Jackson paced. He was on his phone, speaking in hushed, urgent tones to someone. As soon as he hung up, the phone vibrated again with an incoming call. This day was spiraling out of his control, and he couldn't afford another black mark on his record. If word got out that he'd harassed yet another innocent traveler, this one a beloved celebrity, for no legitimate reason, Internal Affairs would have his badge. He rubbed a hand over his face. He had his reasons for being cautious. He remembered the smugglers who had slipped through his fingers last year, leaving him looking like a fool. Ever since that failure, he'd been determined not to miss any clue, any suspicious sign. And then there was that side deal he'd made a few months back, a tip-off to certain unscrupulous parties, something that had put extra cash in his pocket. The memory left a sour taste in his mouth. He wasn't proud of it, but certain debts had forced his hand. Now, seeing ChrisHemsworth stroll through with a suspicious souvenir from Indonesia had rung alarm bells. Maybe it was a chance to prove that he wasn't incompetent, that he could actually catch a big fish. But it was quickly turning into a nightmare. No real evidence, no legitimate cause, and the entire internet was raging about border officer from hell. His phone rang again. He recognized the number. Gritting his teeth, he answered. "Jackson." A voice on the other end hissed, "I told you to stay quiet about certain shipments. The man you're holding has nothing to do with us. Why are you drawing attention?" Jackson swallowed. "I thought he might be connected." "Well, he's not," the voice snapped. "We needed you to keep the usual route open. Now you're on the brink of a scandal. Pull the plug on this fiasco before we all go down." The call ended abruptly. Jackson stood there, pulse pounding. He was in far deeper water than he'd ever intended. One misstep, and everything would unravel. His shady connections, the bribes. Internal Affairs was lurking. The supervisor was breathing down his neck. And the man he was detaining was a global icon with millions of fans watching. Slowly, Jackson squared his shoulders. Maybe there was still a way to spin this. If he admitted a mistake now, Internal Affairs would dig around. If he doubled down, but no, that could end even worse. He had to find a middle path. Trying to steady his breathing, Jackson re-entered the screening room. Hemsworth was standing now, the younger officer Diaz hovering near him. Both men turned to look at Jackson, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Chris sensed a new energy in the room. Jackson seemed rattled, his stiff demeanor betrayed by the faint tremor in his hands. For a moment, Chris wondered if the test results had come back definitive, but Jackson simply cleared his throat. "Mr. Hemsworth, it appears that the residue found on the carving is of no concern. We've been informed by the lab that it's likely plant-based. There's no evidence of narcotics or any other illicit substance." Relief flickered through Chris, but he kept his reaction measured. "So I'm free to go." Jackson hesitated. "There's still the matter of your name being flagged." Diaz spoke up gently. "But we determined that was due to an alias overlap with the actual suspect, right? It's a bureaucratic error." Jackson shot Diaz a warning glare, but the younger officer stood firm. Chris glimpsed a small surge of courage behind the young man's eyes. "Yes, well," Jackson continued, "given all the confusion, we'll need to do a final verification. Then you'll be on your way." Chris exhaled, at last a path forward. "Thank you," he said, voice calm despite the swirling frustration inside. "Don't thank me," Jackson muttered. He tapped at the computer, printing out a few forms. You'll sign these documents stating you're aware of the confusion and that you received your item back with no claims to hold customs responsible for the inconvenience. Chris glanced at the papers. Standard disclaimers, it seemed. But he couldn't help noticing how Jackson's hand trembled slightly when he placed them on the table. Something had changed in the officer's demeanor. Less combative, more worried. Chris carefully read through the pages, wanting no further entanglements. When he was satisfied, he signed. Then he retrieved his passport and the evidence bag containing the wooden carving. Jackson eyed him as if about to say something more. But the door opened again, revealing Lieutenant Berg. Her gaze darted between Jackson, Diaz, and Chris. "I just spoke with the district office," she said, tension in her voice. "They're livid that this situation escalated. Mr. Hemsworth, you're free to go." Chris nodded in gratitude, collecting his belongings. A swirl of emotions coursed through him, relief, anger, and a deep sense that this had been more than a random security check. Before stepping away, Chris turned to Jackson, meeting the officer's gaze. Chris's voice was measured. "I respect the duty you perform, but I hope in the future no one else has to endure this kind of treatment without solid evidence." Jackson stiffened. For a moment, Chris saw regret flicker in the man's eyes, maybe even shame. Then Jackson squared his shoulders and said nothing. Despite being formally cleared to leave, Chris discovered the fight was far from over. He emerged from the restricted zone only to face a throng of reporters, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. News had spread quickly. Chris Hemsworth detained at JFK. The headlines were already swirling. He felt a stab of annoyance. Public spectacle was the last thing he needed. But he reminded himself that transparency might be his best ally. Pausing at the rope line, he raised a hand to quiet the questions. "Is it true you were accused of smuggling antiques, Chris?" one reporter shouted. "Were you treated unfairly by the border officer?" another asked. "Are you going to miss your scheduled hospital visit?" asked a third, the concern in her voice genuine. Chris steadied his breath. He didn't want to add fuel to the fire, but he refused to lie. He owed it to himself and to anyone else who might have been in a similar situation, to be honest. "I'm grateful to be released," he said calmly, his voice carrying over the crowd. "I was detained for reasons that turned out to be unfounded. I'm sure people were just doing their job, though it seems mistakes were made. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a commitment to keep with children who are counting on me." A flurry of questions erupted. "Do you plan on filing a complaint? Are you going to sue?" Chris shook his head. "I have no such intentions right now. My focus is on making it to those hospital visits. I appreciate everyone's concern, but that's all I have to say." He slipped through the crowd, aided by a small team of airport security who escorted him toward the exit. Whispers trailed after him, and on Twitter, speculation was running rampant. His phone buzzed nonstop with messages from friends, colleagues, and fans, all wanting to know what had happened. In the car heading toward Manhattan, Chris leaned his head back against the seat, letting out a long sigh. Had he truly walked away unscathed? He still felt the weight of the entire ordeal pressing down on him, the lingering question of why Jackson had pushed so hard. Chris arrived at the first hospital late, nearly 2 hours past the scheduled time. A bright-eyed hospital coordinator named Melanie greeted him in the lobby, looking relieved that he'd shown up at all. "Mr. Hemsworth, we were worried you weren't going to make it. Are you okay?" she asked, concern etching her features. He mustered a reassuring smile. "I'm fine, just got held up at the airport. Let's not waste any more time. I'd like to see the kids as soon as possible." Melanie led him through the hallways to a large recreation room. The moment Chris stepped inside, an excited chorus of cheers and gasps filled the air. Children, some in wheelchairs, others in hospital gowns, beamed at the sight of him. They waved, clapped, and called his name. The tension of the day melted away for a moment. This was the reason he'd come, these smiles, these moments of joy. He moved from child to child, chatting warmly, signing autographs, and even sharing a silly joke or two. Despite the rough morning, Chris found renewed purpose in their laughter. Halfway through the visit, a small boy named Ethan, battling a rare illness, tugged at his sleeve. "Are you really a superhero?" the boy asked, eyes wide with admiration. Chris knelt to the boy's level. "I play one in the movies," he said gently. "But the real superheroes are kids like you who keep fighting no matter what." Ethan's face lit up, and Chris's heart clenched at the purity of the moment. This was worth every second of trouble at the airport. Once the visit concluded, Melanie approached with tears in her eyes. "Thank you, Chris. You made their day." He nodded, touched by her gratitude. "I'm just happy to be here." As he departed the hospital, a few more reporters were waiting outside, seeking interviews about the earlier detention. Chris ignored them, not wanting the airport incident to overshadow the kids' stories. But he couldn't ignore the swirl of social media. The hashtag ChrisHemsworth detained was trending, and thousands of fans were demanding answers. Even as Chris pressed on with his schedule, hopping between New York hospitals, sharing time with children and families, he sensed a growing storm online. The video of his composed response at JFK's immigration area was going viral. People praised his calm demeanor, while condemning what they perceived as harassment by the border officer. Television pundits weighed in. Some criticized the border officer for overstepping his authority. Others insisted it was standard procedure. Conspiracy theories emerged, suggesting Chris might have been set up or that the government wanted to make an example of him. Through it all, Chris stayed largely silent, focusing on his charity work. But behind the scenes, his attorney, Carmen Green, was digging deeper. She reached out to Chris repeatedly, informing him that the incident had sparked inquiries into the officer's background. "The story isn't as simple as a random check," she explained over the phone one evening. Chris's exhaustion weighed on him. He'd spent the day moving from ward to ward, comforting kids. "What did you find?" "There are allegations that Officer Jackson has been involved in questionable detentions before, especially involving high-profile individuals." Chris closed his eyes. "Sounds like a pattern. Do you think this is going to escalate?" Carmen sighed. "It might. Internal Affairs is now investigating him. The department wants to avoid a PR meltdown, so they're pushing for a quick resolution. But we all know how these things can drag on. If Jackson feels cornered, he might lash out publicly. Who knows what skeletons he has in his closet?" Chris absorbed the information. "Well, if there's wrongdoing, I hope it's exposed, but I don't want to be dragged into a legal battle. My priority is to fulfill these charity commitments." Carmen understood. "Keep doing what you're doing. Just be prepared. The media might not let this go easily." True to her warning, by the next day, dozens of headlines circled the internet. "Border officer harasses Chris Hemsworth. Hollywood star takes the high road." The footage showed Chris patiently explaining his situation, never raising his voice, while Officer Jackson grilled him. It painted a damning portrait of Jackson's aggressive stance. Meanwhile, in a quiet office within the airport, Jackson was cornered by internal affairs officers. A wiry man named Agent Fowler led the interrogation, sliding documents across the table. They outlined previous complaints against Jackson, suspicious patterns in his arrest records, and wire transfers into his bank account that didn't match his salary. "How do you explain these transactions, Officer Jackson?" Fowler asked, voice calm but firm. Jackson's hands trembled. "They're personal, loans from friends. They have nothing to do with my work." Fowler tilted his head. "We spoke to some of these friends. They don't recall giving you any loans. Care to revise your statement?" A bead of sweat trickled down Jackson's temple. He realized his time was up. I did some off-the-books consulting." "Consulting," Fowler repeated, lifting an eyebrow. "On what exactly?" Jackson clenched his jaw. The memory of that phone call from his contact flickered in his mind. He couldn't betray them, or he'd be in even worse trouble. But right now, he was facing career-ending accusations. He found himself wedged between revealing his ties to a smuggling ring that had paid him for intelligence on cargo routes and trying to keep it buried. If he came clean, he might earn leniency, but then he'd become a target for dangerous people. If he lied, well, Internal Affairs already had a mountain of evidence. He sucked in a ragged breath. "All right," he mumbled, "I'll tell you what I can." The investigation deepened, and soon major news outlets caught wind that the officer who had detained ChrisHemsworth was under formal scrutiny for corruption. The rumor mills spun out of control. Some claimed Jackson had intentionally targeted Chris, hoping to gain attention or hush money. Others believed the officer was simply incompetent, or that he'd singled out Chris for personal reasons. In the midst of this media tempest, Chris pressed forward with his East Coast charity tour. He traveled to Philadelphia, Boston, and finally Washington, D.C., meeting countless children, families, and medical staff. Yet even as he brought smiles to hospital rooms, reporters loomed outside, desperate for a soundbite about the blossoming scandal. Eventually, Chris agreed to a short press conference in Washington, D.C., primarily to address the airport incident so he could refocus attention on the real reason for his travels, supporting healthcare for children. Standing at a podium inside a modest community center, he surveyed the row of cameras. "I understand there's a lot of interest in what happened at JFK," he began, "and I want to clarify a few things. First, I hold no grudge against the officer who detained me. I believe in due process. If there's an investigation underway, let it take its course." A flurry of camera flashes accompanied his statement. The press braced for more. "Second," Chris continued, "let's remember that airport security is crucial. Mistakes and misjudgments happen, but it's our responsibility to address them transparently. I was inconvenienced, yes, but I also understand that security officers have a challenging job. If it turns out there was wrongdoing, I trust the system to handle it." Reporters immediately began shouting questions. "Chris, are you filing a lawsuit? Do you think other travelers might have suffered the same harassment from Officer Jackson?" Chris pressed his lips together for a moment, then spoke carefully. "I'm not here to speculate on what's happened in other cases. My priority has been and continues to be raising awareness for pediatric health care. I'd rather channel my energy into that cause." Another question rang out. "A viral video shows you stayed calm under pressure. Do you have a message for anyone who feels powerless in front of authority?" Chris thought of all the anxious hours he'd spent in that interrogation room. "Yes," he said slowly. "Stay polite, cooperate if you can, but never hesitate to stand up for your rights or get help, legal help if necessary. Sometimes it's a balance between defending yourself and not escalating a bad situation. But always remember that truth has a way of coming out in the end." With that, Chris ended the briefing, hoping it would quell the media storm. His words carried weight. Across social media, countless individuals shared stories of encountering overzealous officials or facing false accusations. Chris's stance struck a chord, calm, respectful, but resolute. People admired how he refused to feed into a feud. Instead, he focused on the bigger picture, helping others. Meanwhile, Officer Jackson's scandal exploded. Leaks suggested he might have tipped off smugglers about which security lines to avoid, effectively letting criminals slip through in exchange for kickbacks. The question lingered. Had Jackson targeted Chris because he'd grown paranoid, suspecting everyone with exotic items? Or had he singled out Chris in hopes of extorting something from a famous target? The more the investigation uncovered, the clearer it became that Jackson had abused his power multiple times. The only question was whether Chris would need to testify about his experience. A phone call from Carmen clarified that possibility. "Internal Affairs might request a statement from you," she explained. "They want to document the harassment you faced and see if it matches a pattern in Jackson's other cases." Chris leaned against the hotel window, staring out at the D.C. skyline. "If that helps them reach the truth, I'll cooperate." Carmen paused. "Chris, you realize going on record could entangle you further, especially if Jackson tries to claim you were uncooperative or that your celebrity status influenced the outcome. Chris turned away from the window. I did everything by the book. I have no reason to hide. If my testimony helps prevent future abuse, I'll do it. Understood, Carmen said. I'll let them know. With that decision made, Chris felt a strange sense of closure inch closer. Yes, he had been targeted unfairly, but the truth was emerging. Jackson's hidden corruption was being exposed to the light, and not just because of Chris. There were other travelers coming forward with similar stories. Some had faced intimidation, false accusations of carrying contraband, and even pressure to pay fines on the spot. Stories poured onto social media. A student from Europe posted about how Jackson had confiscated her laptop for suspicious files that turned out to be basic research papers. A businessman from Asia recalled being threatened with deportation when he refused to hand over a customs fee that didn't exist. All these accounts painted a picture of a man who'd strayed far from the oath to serve and protect. Eventually, the U.S. Attorney's Office confirmed formal charges against Jackson for bribery, misuse of authority, and conspiracy with smuggling operations. In a matter of weeks, the entire fiasco turned into a national conversation about abuses of power within certain corners of law enforcement. Chris, for his part, returned to his daily life once his charity tour concluded, but he remained a focal point of the discussion. Late-night talk shows made jokes about how Chris had taken down a crooked cop just by being nice, while serious journalists hailed his calm demeanor as a masterclass in de-escalation. The major confrontation came on a day Chris least expected it. He was back in Los Angeles, attending a press junket for a new film, when a request arrived for him to appear in a preliminary hearing about Jackson's case. Internal Affairs wanted Chris's statements on record, and the hearing would be held via video link. Though it was optional, Chris decided to do it, feeling a moral obligation to help shine a light on the truth. Carmen arranged for a private conference room with secure video conferencing equipment. The afternoon sun streamed in through the windows as Chris settled into a chair, facing a camera. On the screen, he saw the investigating panel: a judge, a federal prosecutor, and Jackson's defense attorney. Jackson himself sat at a separate table in the hearing room. There was no jury at this stage, just legal professionals reviewing evidence and statements to decide how the case would proceed. Chris felt a jolt seeing Jackson's face again. The officer seemed worn, hair disheveled, eyes shadowed by fatigue. The swagger was gone, replaced by a grim resignation. The federal prosecutor began. "Mr. Hemsworth, thank you for joining us. Could you please recount the events on the morning you arrived at JFK Airport?" Calmly, Chris described the sequence: the passport check, the abrupt detention, the accusations, and the inconclusive test on the wooden carving. He detailed Jackson's hostility and how he'd repeatedly refused to release Chris, even after evidence failed to support the suspicion of smuggling. At several points, Jackson's defense attorney objected, claiming Chris's celebrity had led to confusion. But Chris stuck to the facts. The judge allowed him to continue, stating that Chris's account was relevant to establishing a pattern of the officer's behavior. When the prosecutor asked how Chris felt about being singled out, Chris paused thoughtfully. "I felt powerless at times, but I also believed the truth would come out. I never suspected the deeper motives behind Officer Jackson's actions. It became clear only after the fact that he might have been desperate to prove himself or conceal something else." A hush fell over the hearing room. Through the video feed, Chris noticed Jackson lower his gaze. The judge turned to Jackson. "Officer Jackson, do you have any questions for Mr. Hemsworth?" Jackson hesitated. His defense lawyer leaned in, whispering something. Finally, Jackson shook his head. "I have no questions," he mumbled. Chris watched as Jackson squared his shoulders. I want to say something to Mr. Hemsworth." Everyone froze. The defense attorney looked taken aback but didn't stop him. The judge allowed it. Jackson cleared his throat. I'm not proud of what I did. I was under influences I shouldn't have allowed. I took my frustration and fear out on you that day. I apologize. Chris felt a swirl of unexpected emotion. He could see the man was broken, guilt pressing down like a physical weight. Thank you for saying that, Chris replied. I hope you find a way to make things right. The hearing continued for another hour, but the pivotal moment had come and gone. Jackson's quiet admission of guilt was on the record. The legal system would now determine his fate. In the aftermath, news outlets reported that the hearing had gone poorly for Jackson. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Plea bargains and negotiations ensued. Ultimately, he was charged with multiple counts, and while the final sentencing was yet to be decided, his career in law enforcement was over. For Chris, the victory was bittersweet. He hadn't set out to ruin anyone's life. He only wanted to do right by the children he visited in the hospitals and stand up for his own dignity. Yet in the process, an entire ring of corruption had been unmasked. Public reactions swelled with admiration for Chris's grace under pressure. Tabloid headlines read, "Chris Hemsworth's composed response sparks a revolution at JFK," while mainstream media praised how a single viral video could ignite real change. Through it all, Chris tried to steer conversations back to his philanthropic work. He donated more to organizations that protected traveler rights and immigrant advocacy groups, wanting to ensure that others without his fame wouldn't be left voiceless. In interviews, he repeatedly reminded people that he was just one person among many. Think about all the folks who go through airports every day without the protection of a camera, he said in one televised segment. We have to make the system fair for everyone, not just those who can afford high-powered lawyers or get media attention. As the dust settled, the incident at JFK became a symbol of both the destructive power of corruption and the unyielding force of truth when people refuse to be intimidated. Airport authorities rolled out new training programs, emphasizing accountability and transparency. Internal affairs ramped up oversight of officers with repeated complaints. Chris, meanwhile, completed his commitments on the East Coast and returned to his routines, filming, raising his children with his wife, and quietly continuing his charity efforts. Whenever asked about the ordeal, he simply said, "It was a tough experience, but I'm glad something positive came out of it." Sometimes shining a light is all it takes for shadows to disappear. In the weeks that followed, messages poured in from all corners of the globe, people sharing stories of how his composure had inspired them to stand up for themselves when they faced injustice. More than a few travelers thanked him for bringing awareness to certain abuses of power. Jackson, awaiting trial, had apparently given a full confession to federal investigators. Several of his co-conspirators were also identified and apprehended. Though the official verdict was still pending, the case was considered a major success for cleaning up airport corruption. For Chris, closure arrived one morning when he read a heartfelt note on social media from one of the children he'd visited in the hospital, thanking him for making it despite all the chaos. The child wrote, "You showed me that being strong doesn't mean hitting back, but staying calm and kind no matter what. Thanks for visiting me when you were going through so much." Those words resonated deeply. In that moment, Chris realized that sometimes the battles we don't choose, like being harassed at an airport, can become our most important stories. They challenge us to be better, to make choices that reflect the person we want to be. And so his journey ended not with a triumphant flourish or a public spectacle, but with a quiet, personal understanding. Real heroism often lies in compassion, patience, and unwavering commitment to the truth. If you enjoyed this story and want more tales of perseverance and integrity, remember to subscribe for future updates. Here, to more stories where truth prevails over deception, where every voice can be heard, and where one person's calm resolve can spark change for everyone.